Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to tell you a thrilling, intense, and deeply emotional story. A story about justice, injustice, and the courage of a father who is willing to face the darkness to protect his son. Did this story send chills down your spine? If you enjoyed it, don't forget to share this video and subscribe to the channel for more exciting content. The sun hung low over Los Angeles, bathing the city in a haunting amber glow. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, a kind of silence that didn't belong in a place usually teeming with life. It was the kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Marcus Johnson, a former boxing champion whose fists had once ruled the ring, walked down the cracked pavement with his 10-year-old son, Jaden. The boy clutched a chocolate ice cream cone, his small hands sticky from melted drips. His laughter echoed through the streets, carefree and innocent, completely unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon them. "This is the best ice cream ever, Dad," Jaden mumbled between mouthfuls. Marcus chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "Told you. Back in my day, this was he stopped mid-sentence." A chill crawled up his spine. It wasn't the cool evening breeze that sent the shiver. It was something else. Something Jaden slowed. Marcus turned his, "Probably just your imagination, kid," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure if he'd be Jaden swallowed, glancing over his shoulder again. "I don't think so." The unsettling feeling only grew stronger as they neared their parked car. Then, without warning, a low guttural screech of tires cut through the silence. Marcus spun around just in time to see a black and white police cruiser roll up to the queue. The car made no sound except for the eerie whine of its siren cutting off too abruptly. No gravel crunched beneath its tires. It was as if it had materialized out of. The doors swung open slowly, deliberately, and out stepped Officer Brian Callahan. He wasn't like the other officers Marcus had encountered in his life. There was no urgency in his movement, no tension in his jaw. Instead, he moved with a calm, eerie precision. He stood there for a moment, just watching. A slow, sickening smirk spread across his face. "You two look suspicious," he finally said, his voice a low rasp, devoid of real emotion. Marcus stiffened. He had dealt with law enforcement before. But this was different. This wasn't just another cop looking for trouble. This was something else entirely. Jaden stepped closer to his father, sensing the tension. Marcus could feel the boy trembling, though he tried to stay strong. "Excuse me?" Marcus asked, his voice firm but controlled. Callahan didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned his head slightly as if listening to something no one else could hear. Then, with a slow tilt of his head, he pointed a finger at Jaden. "This your kid?" The way he emphasized the word "your" made Marcus's blood boil. His hands instinctively curled into fists. "Yeah," Marcus said coldly. "Why?" Callahan's smirk deepened. He took a step forward, the weight of his presence suffocating. "He looks like someone we've been looking for, a robbery suspect," Jaden gasped. Marcus felt a surge of fury rise in his chest. "He's 10, Marcus said through gritted teeth. "You really think—" "That don't mean nothing," Callahan interrupted. "I need to check him." The air grew heavier, pressing down on Marcus's chest like a 1,000-pound weight. The streetlights above flickered, casting eerie shadows that twisted unnaturally. The distant sounds of the city, the honking, the chatter, the distant hum of life, all seemed to fade into the background. Jaden's breathing grew uneven. He clutched at Marcus's sleeve, his wide eyes darting between his father and the officer. Marcus had seen fear in people before. He'd seen it in his opponents, in men who knew they were about to be knocked out cold. But he had never seen fear like this, in his own son's eyes. It was then that he realized this wasn't just a traffic stop. This wasn't about routine police work. This was something far worse. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt fear too. The air between Marcus and Officer Callahan grew thick with tension, a heavy, suffocating presence that made every second stretch into eternity. The streetlights above flickered, their glow struggling to stay alive against the creeping darkness. Jaden clung to his father's arm, his small body rigid with fear. Marcus could feel the tremble in his son's grip, a silent plea for safety. He had to stay calm, had to control the storm building inside him. Callahan took a step forward, his polished boots making no sound against the pavement. That eerie smirk was still plastered across his face. I asked you a question, Johnson, Callahan drawled, his voice unnervingly slow, as if he had all the time in the world. This your kid? Marcus's jaw tightened. Every instinct in his body screamed that this wasn't a normal encounter. There was something about this officer, his movements, his voice, the way the shadows seemed to cling to him, that sent every nerve in Marcus's body on high alert. Yeah, Marcus said, keeping his voice steady. Why? Callahan's smirk widened. His hand hovered near his belt, but he didn't go for his gun. Instead, his fingers rested against something smaller, his pepper spray. He looks like someone we've been looking for, Callahan said, his tone thick with amusement. Like this was some twisted joke only he understood. A robbery suspect, Marcus scoffed. He's 10 years old. You really think... That don't mean nothing, Callahan cut him off. His voice had a strange edge to it, a hollow resonance that made the hairs on Marcus's arms stand up. I need to check him. Jaden flinched at the officer's words. His breathing hitched, his grip on his father's sleeve tightening. Marcus felt the heat rise in his chest, the old fighter inside him screaming to act, to strike first before it was too late. No, Marcus said firmly, stepping in front of his son. You're not touching him. Callahan exhaled slowly, his expression shifting from amusement to something darker, something almost hungry. His fingers tapped idly against the canister of pepper spray. You resisting, Johnson? His voice was a low whisper now, like the words themselves carried a deeper threat. Marcus didn't move. He held his ground, his eyes locked onto the officers. This was a battle of wills now, a test of who would break first. Callahan tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then he sighed, almost disappointed. Shame, he muttered. Before Marcus could react, Callahan moved. The officer's hand shot to his belt with lightning speed. Marcus barely had time to process what was happening before he saw a flash of silver, the canister pulled free in one fluid motion. Jaden gasped, stepping backward in fear. Marcus lunged. Too late. With a sickening hiss, a cloud of pepper spray erupted into the air, its venomous mist engulfing Jaden's face. The boy screamed. The sound was raw, piercing, a gut-wrenching cry that ripped through the empty street. He dropped his ice cream, his small hands clawing desperately at his eyes, trying to rub away the invisible fire that burned into his skin. Marcus's world exploded. Everything else, the streetlights, the cold pavement, the eerie silence of the city, disappeared in an instant. The only thing left was his son's screams and the monstrous laughter of the man responsible. Callahan took a step back, his smirk returning as he watched Jaden writhing in agony. Oops, he said mockingly, tilting his head. Guess he shouldn't have resisted. Marcus's fists clenched so tightly his knuckles cracked. For years, he had fought in the ring, had learned the power of patience, the discipline of control. But this wasn't a ring. There were no referees, no cameras, no bell to end the round. This was different. This was war. The world around Marcus seemed to slow down. His muscles coiled like a spring, his breath steady, his focus narrowing into a single point. He had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of violence. Now, for the first time, he would unleash it without restraint. Callahan was still grinning, still standing there like he was untouchable. He never saw the punch coming. The moment Jaden's screams filled the air, something inside Marcus snapped. His son collapsed to the pavement, clutching at his burning eyes, his tiny fingers desperate to wipe away the invisible fire, searing his skin. His cries of agony carved deep into Marcus's soul, deeper than any punch he had ever taken in the ring. His hands shook, not from fear but from the sheer, overwhelming rage boiling inside him. Callahan chuckled, a slow, taunting sound, as if he were enjoying the show. He spun the canister of pepper spray between his fingers, like a magician playing with a trick coin. Yeah, he mused, his voice devoid of empathy. Guess I used a little too much. Marcus moved before his mind could even register the action. Like a coiled spring unleashed, his fist rocketed forward with terrifying speed, colliding with Callahan's jaw with a sickening crack. The officer's head snapped back violently, his sunglasses flying off his face and shattering against the pavement. The impact sent Callahan stumbling, but Marcus wasn't done, not even close. Before the officer could regain his footing, Marcus was on him, his body a blur of controlled fury. His left hand snatched Callahan by the collar, pulling him forward as his right fist slammed into his gut with the force of a wrecking ball. A deep, guttural wheeze escaped the officer's lips as all the air was driven from his lungs. His knees buckled, and for the first time, the cocky smirk was gone. Buckled, and for the first time, the cocky smirk was gone. Marcus could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. But it wasn't like the high before a fight. This wasn't about sport, about competition. This was war. Callahan gasped, clutching his stomach, his face contorted in pain. You just... Marcus grabbed him by the front of his uniform, lifting him off the ground with unnatural ease. His voice was a growl, raw and brimming with restrained violence. You maced my son. Callahan barely had time to react before Marcus launched him backward, sending him crashing against the hood of his own police cruiser. The metal buckled beneath the force, the windshield spiderwebbing from the impact. The world around them froze. The flickering streetlights buzzed overhead, casting long, eerie shadows. The street, once silent, was now alive with murmurs, voices of onlookers emerging from the darkness. People had been watching from behind store windows, from alleyways, from the edges of the street. Then, the unmistakable glow of smartphone screens lit up the night. The crowd was recording, every second of it. Marcus didn't care. Let the world see. Let them all see what happens when you come after a man's child. Callahan groaned, trying to push himself up, his confidence shattered. He reached for his baton, his hands trembling. Marcus took a slow step forward, his knuckles still dripping with the officer's sweat and blood. His voice was ice cold, each word measured like a death sentence. Pick that up, he said, nodding toward the baton. Go ahead. Callahan hesitated. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. He looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and for the first time there was fear in his eyes. The man standing before him wasn't just an ex-boxer. He was a father who had nothing left to lose. Marcus's entire body radiated pure, unfiltered wrath, the kind of rage that couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be talked down. A primal force of nature. Callahan's fingers twitched, hovering over the baton. But something deep inside him, some buried animal instinct for survival, told him not to. Marcus exhaled, his breath slow and controlled, forcing himself to hold back. He turned his gaze to Jaden, who was still on the ground, his small body shaking, his sobs fading into uneven gasps. That sight alone was enough to pull Marcus back from the edge. He turned away from Callahan, heading straight for his son, because Jaden needed him more than this coward deserved to be punished. But just as he reached for his boy, a sharp, violent crack split the night. The baton struck Marcus's back. The force sent a shock of pain up his spine, but it wasn't enough to bring him down. He froze for a moment. His body went still, eerily still. The entire street held its breath. Callahan, his face twisted in desperate anger, raised the baton again, his teeth bared in something between fear and determination. He thought he had the upper hand. He was wrong. Marcus turned back slowly, his dark eyes locking onto Callahan's. And in that moment, the officer realized his mistake. Marcus smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It wasn't a reassuring smile. It was the smile of a man who had just been given a reason to let go. Callahan didn't even have time to blink before Marcus struck. The instant the baton struck Marcus's back, the world shifted. For a split second, everything went deathly silent. The city, the distant hum of passing cars, even the murmurs of the crowd watching from the shadows, all of it vanished beneath the deafening roar of Marcus's rage. Callahan stood there, still gripping the baton, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. His face twisted into a look of realization, then regret. He had made the biggest mistake of his life. Marcus moved like a storm, his body twisting with precision, honed over years in the ring. In one fluid motion, he grabbed Callahan's wrist before the officer could raise the baton again. Then, with terrifying ease, he snapped it backward. A sickening pop echoed through the street as Callahan's arm bent at an unnatural angle. His scream tore through the night, The baton clattered to the pavement as the officer stumbled, his once arrogant face contorted in agony. He fell to his knees, cradling his twisted wrist, his breath hitching between sharp, painful gasps. Marcus loomed over him, his chest rising and falling in steady, controlled breaths. The light above flickered erratically, casting his shadow across Callahan's trembling form. The officer looked up, his eyes filled with something Marcus had been waiting to see all night: fear. The crowd exploded gasps and murmurs, turning into an eruption of excitement and disbelief. Phones were everywhere now, recording from every possible angle. The fight wasn't just happening on the street anymore, it was going viral in real time. You just assaulted an officer, Callahan wheezed, desperation lacing his words. Marcus tilted his head, rolling his neck slowly. No, he said, his voice deep, quiet, but filled with the promise of destruction. That was just a warning. Callahan, teeth clenched in pain, tried to stand, but Marcus was already on him. With one brutal uppercut, Marcus sent Callahan flying backward. The impact lifted the officer off his feet, his body hitting the hood of his own cruiser so hard the metal dented inward. The force shattered the windshield, cracks webbing out like lightning. Callahan's body slid down onto the pavement, a broken, defeated mess of groans and wheezes. The crowd lost it. Some people cheered, others just stood there in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. A cop, one of the untouchable ones, had been laid out in the street like a common thug. For a moment, everything felt still again. Marcus stood there, breathing heavy. The warrior inside him awakened like a sleeping giant. He should have stopped. He should have walked away. But then he heard it. Jaden's sob. Marcus turned. His son was still on the ground, still rubbing at his eyes, his small frame shaking. And in that moment, Marcus knew he wasn't finished yet. Callahan groaned, trying to crawl away, his hand groping for his radio. His lips muttered something, maybe calling for backup, maybe just cursing his own stupidity. Marcus took a step forward, then another. Callahan, sensing the impending doom, scrambled to his feet, stumbling backward like a wounded animal. Marcus grabbed him by the vest, effortlessly. Then, with a primal roar, he lifted Callahan clean off the ground. The officer's feet dangled, his arms flailing uselessly. Marcus spun, and then threw Callahan down onto the pavement like a rag doll. The force sent the officer skidding across the asphalt, his body hitting hard, rolling before he finally slumped against the curb, unmoving. For the first time that night, Callahan didn't speak, didn't threaten, didn't sneer. He just lay there, his chest rising and falling in ragged, shallow breaths. Marcus took another step forward, but something stopped him, a sound in the distance. Sirens. They were getting louder, fast. The flashing red and blue lights painted the buildings around them in eerie streaks of color. The cavalry was coming? The crowd, sensing what was about to happen, started backing up. Some disappeared into the alleys, others lingered just long enough to make sure their footage was uploaded. Marcus exhaled sharply, the adrenaline still coursing through him like fire. Callahan had been handled, but this fight wasn't over. The wailing of sirens pierced the night, growing louder with each passing second. The cavalry had arrived. Marcus stood tall, his chest still heaving, his fists still clenched. Beneath his feet, Officer Callahan lay broken and gasping, his once confident sneer now replaced with the hollow stare of a man who had lost everything in a single night. Blood trickled from his split lip, mixing with the dirt on the pavement. He reached for his radio with trembling fingers, his voice a rasp. Back up. Officer down. He coughed, the words barely making it past his bruised throat. The red and blue lights bathed the street in a chaotic, pulsing glow, illuminating the scattered onlookers who still dared to remain. The crowd was no longer just spectators. They were witnesses. Phones were everywhere, recording, streaming. The world was watching. The police cruisers skidded to a stop, their doors flinging open as officers poured out, hands on their holsters. Tension crackled in the air. For a split second, no one moved. Then, stepping out from the leading vehicle, Captain Alejandro Morales emerged, his expression unreadable. Unlike the younger officers, he didn't immediately draw his weapon. His sharp, calculating eyes swept over the scene. The battered officer on the ground, the towering figure of Marcus, still standing like an unmovable force, and most importantly, the small, trembling child behind him. He let out a long sigh, rubbing his temples before finally speaking. "Damn it, Callahan," he muttered under his breath, then louder, "What the hell did you do this time?" The response came not from Callahan, but from the crowd. Dozens of voices erupted at once, overlapping in chaotic fury. "He maced a kid. He attacked them for no reason. Tyson was just defending his son. This bastard deserved every bit of it." Morales raised a hand, his expression hardening. Enough. His voice carried authority, cutting through the noise like a blade. Then he turned his attention to Marcus. This was the moment. "Did you put your hands on my officer?" Morales asked, his voice steady. A test. Marcus didn't flinch. He squared his shoulders, his voice deep and unwavering. "Yeah," he said, "and I'd do it again." A heavy silence followed. The younger officers tensed, their fingers tightening around their weapons. But then, to everyone's shock, Morales smirked. "Good." Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Before Callahan could even protest, Morales waved a hand. "Arrest him!" Two officers moved in, grabbing Callahan under his arms and hauling him to his feet. His shock turned to outrage as he thrashed weakly against their grip. "Wait! What? I'm the victim here!" he spat, his voice rising into a pathetic shriek. Morales shook his head. "Not tonight, Callahan." His eyes, filled with exhaustion and disgust, locked onto the disgraced officer. "You crossed a line." As Callahan was dragged toward a waiting cruiser, the crowd exploded into cheers, their voices ringing through the streets of Los Angeles like a victory cry. The fight was over. Justice had been served. But for Marcus, there was only one victory that mattered. He turned back to his son, dropping to one knee. Jaden was still rubbing at his swollen eyes, his small face streaked with tears and fear. Marcus reached out, his hands gentle despite the rage still simmering in his veins. "Son," he whispered, "you okay?" Jaden sniffled, blinking rapidly. His father's face was blurry, but he could see the strength in his eyes, the unwavering presence of a man who would never let anything happen to him. "Dad," his voice wavered, You knocked out a cop." Marcus sighed, brushing a hand over Jaden's hair. "No, son," he said softly. "I knocked out a bully." The tension in the air didn't dissolve completely. Even with Callahan cuffed and shoved into the back of a cruiser, the scene still pulsed with electricity, a city on edge, waiting to see what happened next. The crowd was still gathered, their faces a mixture of triumph and wariness. They had seen something rare tonight, real justice. But would it last? Marcus stood there, his chest still rising and falling with the remnants of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He wasn't used to this feeling. In the ring, every fight had a clear end. A bell, a referee, a victor. Out here, the fight was never really over. Captain Morales exhaled heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose, before turning back to Marcus. "You know I should be arresting you too, right?" Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. What could he say? That he didn't regret it? That he'd do it again? That he had no other choice? Before he could respond, a small voice broke through the weight of the moment. "Mr." Marcus turned to see a young boy, no older than Jaden, standing a few feet away. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and awe. He hesitated, glancing at his mother, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. The boy took another step forward. "Are you a hero?" For the first time that night, Marcus hesitated. A hero. That word had never been meant for him. He was a fighter, a survivor, a man who had spent his life taking hits and throwing them right back. Heroes were the ones who never had to fight in the first place. He glanced down at Jaden, who still clung to his side, his face streaked with tears, but his expression full of something new. Understanding. Marcus crouched, bringing himself eye level with the boy. He didn't smile, didn't put on a show. He just told the truth. "A hero ain't the guy who throws the hardest punch," he said, his voice softer now. "It's the one who stands up when no one else will." The boy's lips parted slightly as if he were trying to absorb those words, to understand their weight. Behind him, Morales let out a small breath. "All right, let's wrap this up." His words broke the spell. The crowd began to disperse, some still recording, some murmuring about what they had just witnessed. Marcus knew that by morning, this would be everywhere. He turned back to Morales. So, what happens now? The captain studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. You go home. Marcus's brows furrowed. That's it? Morales sighed. That's it for tonight. Then, in a lower voice, he added, but be careful. Men like Callahan, they don't go down easy. Marcus heard the warning beneath the words. This wasn't over. As Marcus lifted Jaden into his arms and turned to leave, he felt the weight of the night settle over him. The fight might have ended here on this street, but he knew better than anyone. Some battles never really end.